And now, the gripping conclusion of Fahrenheit 451. I have nothing to say after that, actually. Oh, wait. So, we just met Granger and all the intellectuals. Um, and probably the most important thing I have to say about that is the section where they talk about the world coming to an end and how they've just kind of been waiting in the wings for the world to end so that they can rebuild it. And also the fact that they know that in that rebuilding, they might again come to a place where everybody forgets their values and what's important, and then they have to do the rebuilding again. And I just find it really timely. I always find this book timely for one reason or another. But again, I find this book especially timely now because we're in such a revolutionary moment. I have paint on my hand. I've been doing a lot of arts and crafts. It helps with my sanity because I can't see the people because I'm stuck in my house. But anyway, yeah, we're in such a pivotal point right now, and it almost feels like things are like in such chaos and turmoil that it's like, whoa, like what's happening? There's like this big shift, and how will we come out of it? And like, are we starting over? You know, we have this potential to create change right here and now, and a lot of people are waking up and seeing that. So that's why I think this book is so timely. And if you were reading the last section with me, maybe that part stood out for you while I was reading it, that the world was going to war, and that it was time to recreate, and that they were just waiting for that war to begin and end so that they could rebuild. And it kind of maybe, and I don't know, this is a stretch for you, but for me it's not. Maybe it feels like that for you. Like, I am stuck at home, waiting for the pandemic to end, waiting for social justice still, like, really, but still, yeah. But I mean, and things are starting to shift and move, but like, also waiting for this next presidential election, like waiting for the pandemic, waiting for the next election, waiting to see how and if our world really changes. And it's intense. So, with that being said, let's wrap this story up and see how it ends. Here we go. There was a shriek, and the jets from the city were gone overhead long before the men looked up. Montague stared back at the city far down the river, only a faint glow now. My wife's back there. I'm sorry to hear that. The cities won't do well in the next few days, said Granger. It's strange. I don't miss her. I don't feel much of anything, said Montague. Even if she dies, I realized a moment ago I don't think I'll feel sad. It isn't right. Something must be wrong with me. Listen, said Granger, taking his arm and walking with him, holding aside the bushes to let him past. When I was a boy, my grandfather died, and he was a sculptor. He was also a very kind man who had a lot of love to give the world, and he helped clean up the slum in our town, and he made toys for us, and he did a million things in his lifetime. He was always busy with his hands. And when he died, I suddenly realized I wasn't crying for him at all, but for all the things he did. I cried because he would never do them again. He would never carve another piece of wood or help us raise doves and pigeons in the backyard or play the violin the way he did or tell us jokes the way he did. He was part of us. And when he died, all the actions stopped dead and there was no one to do them just the way he did. He was an individual. He was an important man. I've never gotten over his death. Often I think what wonderful carvings never came to birth because he died. How many jokes are missing from the world, and how many homing pigeons untouched by his hands. He shaped the world. He did things to the world. The world was bankrupt of 10 million fine actions on the night he passed on. Montague walked in silence. Millie, Millie, he whispered. Millie. What? My wife, poor Millie. I can't remember anything. I can't think of her hands. I think of her hands, but I don't see them doing anything at all. They just hang there at her sides or lie there on her lap. Or there's a cigarette in them, but that's all. Montague turned and glanced back. All right, guys. Hopefully you didn't have any disruptions and that reading part went okay because my internet was out for a minute. So, sorry about that. We're going to try to pick off where we left off and hope that it works. So, this is where I think I left off. I'm not sure if you got that all, but hopefully you did. Montague turned and glanced back. What did you give to the city, Montague? Ashes. What did the others give to each other? Nothingness. Granger stood looking back with Montague. Everyone must leave something behind when he dies, my grandfather said. A child, or a book, or a painting, or a house, or a wall built, or a pair of shoes made, or a garden planted. Something your hand touched some way so your soul has somewhere to go when you die. And when people look at that tree or flower you planted, you're there. It doesn't matter what you do, he said, so long as you change something from the way it was before you touched it into something that's like you after you take your hands away. The difference between the man who just cuts lawns and a real gardener is in the touching, he said. The lawn cutter might just as well have not been there at all. The gardener will be there a lifetime. Granger moved his hand. My grandfather showed me some V2 rocket films once, 50 years ago. Have you ever seen the atom bomb mushroom from 200 miles up? It's a pinprick, it's nothing, with the wilderness all around it. My grandfather ran off the V2 rocket film 12 times and then hoped that someday our cities would open up and let the green and the land and the wilderness in more, to remind people that we're allotted a little space on Earth and that we survive in that wilderness, that can take back what it has given as easily as blowing its breath on us or sending to the sea to tell us we are not so big. When we forget how close the wilderness is at night, my grandpa said, someday it will come in and get us. For we will have forgotten how terrible and real it can be, you see? Granger turned to Montague. Grandfather's been dead for all these years, but if you lifted my skull, by God, in the convolutions of my brain, you'd find the big ridges of his thumbprint. He touched me. As I said earlier, he was a sculptor. I hate a Roman named Status Quo, he said to me. Stuff your eyes with wonder, he said. Live as if you dropped dead in 10 seconds. See the world, it's more fantastic than any dream made or paid for in factories. Ask no guarantees, ask for no security. There never was such an animal. And if there were, it would be related to the great sloth, which hangs upside down in a tree all day and every day, sleeping its life away. To hell with that, he said. Shake the tree and knock the great sloth down on his ass. Look, cried Montague. And in that, and the war began and ended in that instant. Later, the men around Montague could not say if they had really seen anything. Perhaps the merest flourish of light and motion in the sky. Perhaps the bombs were there and the jets 10 miles, 5 miles, 1 mile up for the merest instant, as quick as the whisper of a scythe, the war was finished. Once the bomb release was yanked, it was over. This was not to be believed. It was merely a gesture. Montague saw the flirt of a great metal fist over the far city, and he knew the scream of the jets that would follow, would say after the deed, disintegrate, leave no stone on another, perish, die. Montague held the bombs in the sky for a single moment, with his mind and his hands reaching helplessly up at them. Run, he cried to Faber, to Clarice, run! To Mildred, get out of there! But Clarice, he remembered, was dead. And Faber was out. There in the deep valleys of the country somewhere, the 5 a.m. bus was on its way from one desolation to another. And Mildred. Get out, run! He saw her, in her hotel room somewhere now, in the half-second remaining with the bombs a yard, a foot, an inch from her building. He saw her leaning toward the great shimmering walls of color and motion where the family talked and talked and talked to her, where the family prattled and chatted and said her name and smiled at her and said nothing of the bomb that was an inch, now a half inch, now a quarter inch from the top of the hotel, leaning into the wall as if it had a hunger of looking would find the secret of her sleepless unease there. Mildred leaning anxiously, nervously, as if to plunge, drop, fall into that swarming immensity of color, to drown in its bright happiness. The first bomb struck. Mildred! Perhaps, who would ever know? Perhaps the great broadcasting stations with their beams of color and light and talk and chatter went first into oblivion. Montague, falling flat, going down, saw or felt or imagined he saw or felt the walls go dark in Millie's face, heard her screaming because in the millionth part of time left she saw her own face reflected there, in a mirror instead of a crystal ball. And it was such a wildly empty face, all by itself in the room, touching nothing, starved and eating itself, that at last she recognized it as her own and looked quickly up at the ceiling as it and the entire structure of the hotel blasted down upon her, carrying her with 1,000,000 pounds of brick, metal, plaster, and wood to meet other people in the hives below, all on their quick way down to the cellar, where the explosion rid itself of them in its own unreasonable way. I remember. Montague clung to the earth. I remember. Chicago. Chicago a long time ago. Millie and I, that's where we met. I remember now. Chicago a long time ago. The concussion knocked the air across and down the river, turned the men over like dominoes in a line, blew the water in lifting sprays and blew the dust and made the trees above them mourn with a great wind passing away south. Montague crushed himself down, squeezing himself small, eyes tight. He blinked once, and in that instant he saw the city instead of bombs in the air. Montague lying there, eyes gritted shut with a fine wet cement of dust in his now shut mouth, gasping and crying, now thought again, I remember something else. What is it? Yes, part of the Ecclesiastes and Revelation, part of the book, part of it. Quick now, quick, before it gets away, before the shock wears off, before the wind dies. Book of Ecclesiastes, here. He said it over to himself silently, lying flat to the trembling earth. He said the words of it many times, and they were perfect without trying, and there was no Denham's dentrifice anywhere, and it was just the preacher by himself, standing there in his mind, looking at him. There, said a voice. The men lay gasping like fish out on the grass. They held to the earth as children hold to familiar things, no matter how cold or dead, no matter what has happened or will happen. Their fingers were clawed into the dirt, and they were all shouting to keep their eardrums from bursting, to keep their sanity from bursting, mouths open, Montague shouting with them, a protest against the wind that ripped their faces and tore at their lips, making their noses bleed. Montague watched the great dust settle, and the great silence move down upon their world. And lying there, it seemed that he saw every single grain of dust and every blade of grass, and that he heard every cry and shout and whisper going up in the world now. Silence fell down in the sifting dust, and all the leisure they might need to look around, to gather the reality of this day into their senses. Montague looked at the river. We'll go on the river. He looked at the old railroad tracks. Or we'll go that way. Or we'll walk on the highways now, and we'll have time to put things into ourselves. And someday, after it sets in us a long time, it'll come out of our hands and our mouths, and a lot of it will be wrong, but enough of it will be right. We'll just start walking today and see the world, and the way the world walks around and talks, the way it really looks. I want to see everything now. And while none of it will be me when it goes in, after a while, it'll all gather together inside, and it will be me. Look at the world out there. my God, look at it out there, outside me, out beyond my face. And the only way to really touch it is to put it where it's finally me, where it's in the blood, where it pumps around 1,000 times, 10,000 a day. I get a hold of it so it'll never run off. I'll hold onto the world tight someday. I've got one finger on it now. That's a beginning. The wind died. The other men lay a while, on the dawn edge of sleep, not ready to rise up and begin the day's obligations, its fires and foods, its 1,000 details of putting foot after foot and hand after hand. They lay blinking, their dusty eyelids. You could hear them breathing fast, then slower, then slow. Montauk sat up. He did not move any further, however. The other men did likewise. The sun was touching the black horizon with a faint red tip. The air was cold and smelled of coming rain. Silently, Granger arose, felt his arms and legs swearing incessantly under his breath, tears dripping from his face. He shuffled down the river to look upstream. It's flat, he said a long time later. City looks like a heap of baking powder. It's gone. And after a long time after that, I wonder how many knew it was coming. I wonder how many were surprised. And across the world, thought Montauk, how many other cities dead? And in our country, how many? 100, 1,000? Someone struck a match and touched it to a piece of dry paper taken from their pocket, and shoved this under a bit of grass and leaves, and after a while added tiny twigs, which were wet and sputtered but finally caught. And the fire grew larger in the early morning as the sun came up, and the men slowly turned from looking up the river and were drawn to the fire awkwardly, with nothing to say, and the sun colored the backs of their necks as they bent down. Granger unfolded an oilskin with some bacon on it. We'll have a bite, then we'll turn around and walk upstream. They'll be needing us that way. Someone produced a small frying pan, and the bacon went into it, and the frying pan was set on the fire. After a moment, the bacon began to flutter and dance in the pan, and the sputter of it filled the morning air with its aroma. The men watched this ritual silently. Granger looked into the fire. Phoenix. What? There was a silly damn bird called the phoenix back before Christ. Every few hundred years he built a pyre and burned himself up. He must have been the first cousin to man. But every time he burnt himself, he sprang out of the ashes and got himself born all over again. And it looks like we're doing the same thing, over and over. But we've got one damn thing the phoenix never had. We know the damn silly thing we just did. We know all this damn silly things we've done for 1,000 years, and as long as we know that, and always have it around where we can see it, someday we'll stop making the goddamn funeral pyres and jumping into the middle of them. We pick up a few more people. Remember, every generation. Remember, every generation. He took the pan off the fire and let the bacon cool, and they ate it slowly, thoughtfully. Now let's get on upstream, said Granger. And hold on to one thought. You're not important. You're not anything. Someday, the load we're carrying with us will help someone. But even when we had the books on hand a long time ago, we didn't use what we got out of them. We went right on insulting the dead. We went right on spitting in the graves of all the poor ones who died before us. We're going to meet a lot of lonely people in the next week, in the next month, in the next year. And when they ask us what we're doing, you can say, we're remembering. That's where we'll win out in the long run. And someday we'll remember so much that we'll build the biggest goddamn steam shovel in history and dig the biggest grave of all time and shove war in and cover it up. Come on now. We're going to build a mirror factory first and put out nothing but mirrors for the next year and take a long look in them. I want you to think about that one. What would it be like if people started with themselves? What would it be like if people really looked at themselves and looked in the mirror and asked themselves, am I living the way that I believe is right? Am I living in accordance with my values? What are my values? Can I look myself in the eye and know that I am making a difference? Can I look myself in the eye and know that I value myself? Because it all starts inside. You cannot make a change in society if you don't make the change in yourself first. They finished eating and put the fire out. The day was brightening all about them as if a pink lamp had been given more wick. In the trees, the birds had flown away now and come back and settled down. Montauk began walking and after a moment found that the others had fallen in behind him going north. He was surprised and moved aside to let Granger pass, but Granger looked at him and nodded him on. Montauk went ahead. He looked at the river and the sky and the rusting track going back down to where the farms lay, where the barns stood full of hay, where a lot of people had walked by in the night on their way from the city. Later, in a month or 6 months, and certainly not more than a year, he would walk along here again, alone, and keep right on going until he caught up with the people. But now, there was a long morning's walk until noon, and the men were and if the men were silent, it was because there was everything to think about, and much to remember. Perhaps later in the morning, when the sun was up and had warmed them, they would begin to talk, or just say the things they remembered, to be sure they were there, to be absolutely certain that things were safe in them. Montauk felt the slow stir of words, the slow simmer, and when it came his turn, what could he say? What could he offer on a day like this to make the trip a little easier? To everything there is a season. Yes, a time to break down, a time to build up. Yes, a time to keep silence, and a time to speak. Yes, all that. But what else? Something. And on either side of the river there was a tree of life, which bare 12 manner of fruits, and yielded her fruit every month, and the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. Yes, thought Montauk, that's the one I'll save for noon. For noon, when we reach the city. The end. I bet you want to know what it was about. Like what he said. You'll have to check out my review to find out, where I explain the literary allusions, which are actual biblical allusions to Revelations and Ecclesiastes, which I will explain in a PowerPoint review. Stay tuned. Peace out.